Hello, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's CISL seminar. I'd like to introduce Dr. AJ Lauer. She's an educator at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Her work focuses on increasing diversity and inclusion in the HPC field. She is the director of the Summer Internships in Parallel Computational Science, or SciParks program. She sits on the SC Conference's Steering Subcommittee for Diversity and Inclusion, and is a co-author of the Guide to Organizing Inclusive Scientific Meetings. She holds an EDD from Creighton University, an MS from Florida International University, and a BA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so without further ado, here's AJ to talk about why we can't fix what we don't understand.
Thanks, Dave. Hi, everyone. As Dave said, my name is AJ Lauer. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Outreach, Diversity, and Education Team Lead here at NCAR. And I'm really happy to be speaking to you today a little bit about the occupational climate and high-performance computing, what it means to work within HPC, and how that impacts the workforce within our field. So a little bit about me as we start. Before I came to NCAR, I spent 10 years in higher education administration, working at various colleges and universities. And throughout that time, I have always worked on diversity and inclusion in various ways, from doing presentations at conferences to advising student organizations. It's always been a key part of who I am and what I do as a professional. I'm also, within the last 6 years, an educator within high performance computing. So I have the incredible pleasure of working on workforce development and running an internship program within this really interesting niche field of computing that we call high performance computing. So the study that I'm going to present to you today is based on my dissertation. And when I was starting to think about what I wanted to study for my dissertation, I was thinking about the work that I do every day. And the work that I do every day is trying to bring in students from all sorts of different backgrounds and get them interested in high performance computing and hopefully help them into this field and stay in this field. But something from the beginning of my career at NCAR that kind of concerned me was that we were bringing these students in and we were trying to convince them to stay, but at the same time, I was hearing a lot about how HPC wasn't very welcoming necessarily for women and people of color and people with disabilities and LGBT folks and things like that. And so on the one hand, we were trying to improve the diversity within the workforce, but on the other hand, we also were acknowledging that there were issues within the workforce that we were asking people to come into. And that didn't really sit very well with me. And so I decided that I wanted to focus on how to improve the workforce that we're inviting these students into so that I can feel better about sending these students out into the workforce after they come through our program. So the picture that you see on the left is from a couple of years ago. We brought some of our student interns up to see our supercomputer, Cheyenne. And most of the time when you see a picture of HPC folks, it does not look like the picture that you see on your screen. That is a representation, I think, of what we would love for the HPC workforce to look like in some day, but it's not what it looks like right now. And so how can we fix this, this HPC workforce and make it a more welcoming place if we don't understand it? And so this study that I'm going to present to you today is one of only about 4 that are really looking at what the workforce is in HPC, what it's like to work within HPC, to start giving us some clue as to how we can start to work on that workforce climate in HPC so that when these amazing students join us, then they're excited to stay with us rather than being pushed out by an unfriendly place to be. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what we already know about the cyber infrastructure workforce in HPC and how we can make HPC more inclusive so that we can retain women and people of color in this awesome field that we work in. So what we're going to do today is start by defining diverse and inclusive. And I think that that's an important place to start because different people have different understandings of what those mean. And so I want you all to understand how I'm thinking about these concepts as I'm talking about them throughout the rest of the day. We're going to talk a little bit about what we already know about the cyber infrastructure workforce. What is HPC? What is it like to be here? Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about my dissertation study, and then we will talk about how to take action to make our HPC workplace and occupational climate a better place to be. So diversity is everybody having a seat at the table. Diversity is bodies in rooms. It is having a variety of people with different backgrounds and different understandings of the world and different viewpoints and different educational backgrounds in the same place. People have a seat at the table. They are here and present. Inclusion is once we get all of those people into the room, we also have everybody having a voice in the conversation. So they're not just sitting there passively and being there, but they are also being welcomed into the conversation. And they're able to speak their minds because they feel included into the conversation. The next step is belonging. And belonging is everyone feeling that their voice is heard and valued in a space. There's some really interesting research coming out about belonging and the impact of belonging on retention of employees, and how for anybody in a workplace, it is really important to make sure that we are hearing people and we are showing them that they are valued. And the ways that we do that differ depending on the person, right? Do we show that we value people through their compensation? Do we show that we value them by taking their ideas seriously and giving them credit for their ideas when they have them? Those are all things that factor into this feeling of, oh, this is a place that I want to be. I belong here. I want to contribute here, and my contributions are going to be taken seriously. A slightly different take on this that I appreciated recently was, remember this, diversity is a fact. Equity is a choice. So we are choosing to make things equitable for all of those people in the room. Inclusion is an action, and belonging is the outcome. So once we include people and we make sure that all of those voices are being heard, then we have that outcome of belonging, which is what allows us to have people want to stay with us and keep working with us and contribute to our field. So a little bit of a literature review for you. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the STEM and the computing pipelines. Now, there's a lot of conversation about how the pipeline metaphor is flawed. That's like a whole different presentation. I'm going to use it because it is the metaphor that's used in most of the literature. But the pipeline idea is that there exists a pool of people and they get filtered into the pipeline that goes to a certain field. And within STEM, it's often portrayed as being leaky. So at different points along the pipeline, either once people, so in high school, people just drop out of the STEM pipeline because they have a teacher who says girls can't do math, or they get to college and they drop out of the pipeline because something happens with their family and they have to drop out of college, or they run into a faculty person who runs all of their courses as a weed out course rather than taking real understanding of who people are as people when they're students, things like that. So in STEM fields as a whole, the attrition of women is really steep. 52% of women in STEM, science, technology, and engineering quit their jobs, and of those 20% never return to their field. That's atrocious. That is such a huge number, and the pipeline metaphor doesn't really fix it, right? So when we're talking about the pipeline, we're talking about they're coming through and they're just dripping out. We're not talking about how do we weave those folks back in? Are those people coming, maybe they drop out of the technology side, but they're rejoining on the math side. And so that's where the pipeline metaphor is a little bit faulty, but I think that it's good to understand that we are losing people in droves. Within the computing pipeline, there's some great conversation specifically about women, but we're starting to see more about bringing people of currently underrepresented races back into the computing pipeline and making sure that they are here. There's some really interesting information about what happens in computing, or what has happened in the past when we have created majors. When computing was not yet an official major in universities, we actually had a much more diverse pool of people doing the work. And as soon as we started to make computing an official thing, it fell into engineering schools. And engineering schools were really only located in predominantly white institutions that at that time were mostly only admitting men. And so that was part of a contributing factor for how we ended up with a white male dominated field as soon as we started to professionalize computing. And so the computing pipeline is a really interesting thing to look at because it helps us understand how we got here, and provides a little bit of insight into things that we can do to make sure that we don't continue on that path, and that we can continue to fix things and make them better. Diversity in computing is an interesting field. There are two studies that I want to highlight for you. Trouth's identity of, it says gender in IT, but Trouth's theory is all-encompassing. And so she says that we need to be looking not only at how people's experiences with their gender impacts their retention within IT, all of the IT fields, but we also need to look at all of the other factors that influence people's lives. So she was talking race, she was talking socioeconomic status, she was talking about where people were living. McGee did this incredible study of women at the executive level in IT. And she is actually, that's the only study that I have found that breaks it down by both gender and by race and ethnicity. And so she did this incredible job through a qualitative study of laying out the experiences of women, and then also separated it out by differentiated experiences based on their race. And so if this is something that you have any interest in, I highly recommend checking out that McGee study, because it was one of those that had me dancing in my seat when I found it, because it's so interesting. In HPC, we have very little to go on. We've really only got a couple of studies. Berente et al. Didn't write a study, but they did write an article about what they want the HPC workforce to be and what they envision as being the directions that we should go. They had some really great points about how we do need to gain some understanding of what HPC actually is. How are we defining HPC? But then they also talked a little bit about how they believe that professionalizing it will help us gain more respect within academia and within industry, so that people can get paid better, and people can understand what this field is so that they can be excited to join it. And then I'll talk about Frachtenberg and Kainer and Franciana in a second. One of the interesting other studies about computing on the whole, there's this really interesting book all about Silicon Valley and the culture in Silicon Valley. And they said that the occupational culture in Silicon Valley is the operating system that shapes our cognitive and behavioral processes. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind as we continue to talk about what this culture is, right? It is a shared cognitive and behavioral experience within one field that impacts everybody who is in the field, no matter what role they play within that field. So diversity and inclusion within HPC, or academic research computing. I'm going to highlight three different areas for you, and then I'm going to talk very specifically about a couple of different studies. So in Frachtenberg and Kainer did this fabulous study of HPC conferences. They looked at, I think, 5 or 6 different conferences over a span of years, and they were looking specifically at gender. One of the interesting things that they had to do was they had to assume people's gender based on their names, because none of the conferences were publishing their gender related data. And so they had to do this very thorough combing through of everybody's names and sorting them out and trying to figure out who identified as what gender in order to come up with some results. But what they found was that women represent only 10% of presenters at HPC conferences. 3 of the conferences that they looked at had no female session chairs. Now, having session chairs that are diverse is one of the things that we have shown over and over again improves the diversity of the conference. And so if we have 3 conferences out there that have no female session chairs, that probably contributes to that 10% presenter number. And 4 of the conferences had 0 female keynote speakers. They did note that the supercomputing conference was doing better than most of the other conferences, and they assumed that that was because the SC had a diversity and inclusion committee that was specifically working on these efforts. None of the other conferences that they surveyed had specific people working on D&I at their conferences. Athena Franciana did a fascinating dissertation study on gender within HPC, and she had many different directions from which she approached it, including some quantitative data and some qualitative data. She looked at people's experiences in trainings and what they were bringing to trainings and what they were getting out of them. It's 150 pages. Again, if you're interested in all of this stuff, that would be the other thing that I suggest that you read. Her dissertation is fascinating. But one of the things that showed up over and over again was discrimination in the workforce at various levels and the impact of parenthood on somebody's career. So she had some qualitative work where she was actually talking to people or having them write out responses for her, and women said things like getting pregnant is basically the death of your career in high performance computing, or the reason that we don't have any female leaders in HPC is because 20 years ago, they were intentionally trying to weed us out. And so those of us who are still here haven't even made it up to the leadership levels because there was intentional discrimination against women back in the early days of HPC. So it's pretty rough to read, but also very insightful. And I think it lends some good insight into what is happening on the gender front within HPC. It's important to note that there are a lot of programs and there are a lot of great articles out there that talk about the impact of various programs within academic research computing HPC to broaden participation. So the SciParks internship program, of course, I have to mention that because that's the program that I run. There's a really cool program called the SPICE program that is engaging Pacific Islanders and Hawaiians in HPC work. The Women in HPC organization, Exceed does some incredible programs with their Computing for Change and similar things like that. So there are a lot of great programs within academic research computing that are showing the ability to improve that diversity component. Most of them also have an inclusivity and belonging component wrapped into them, but as far as I know, nobody has actually done a really great job of measuring the impact on the inclusion and belonging pieces of their programs. So two specific other things that I want to highlight for you. EDUCAUSE recently did a quick poll, which was very cool. It was only like 20 questions, and they asked a few things that were insightful. And so I'm going to highlight two of those for you here. This chart shows the number of people who said that they had been discriminated against based on certain identities within their lives. And so you can see, here, let me turn on my, doesn't look like I've got the ability to have a, maybe you can see my mouse. So what they did was they asked, based on your gender or gender identity expression, have you been discriminated against? And so what's interesting here is that 28% of people said that they had been discriminated against, but when you look at it, 38% of female respondents said that they had been discriminated against based on their gender identity, and 73% of people who identified as non-binary had said that they had been discriminated against based on their gender identity. So what they've done here is they've shown the overall percentage, but they've also given an indication of people who were in the underrepresented group, what their experiences were. So sexual orientation, only 7% of respondents said that they had experienced discrimination, but 29% of people who identified as LGBTQ said that they had experienced discrimination. And they had, I think, 1,000 something respondents to the survey. So it's a nice size data set. One of the other interesting things that came out of that study was these 3 points. And so they took, have you ever been talked over or ignored in team meetings? And they gave the percentage of how many people with different identities had experienced those things. And so what you can see here is that people with underrepresented identities had higher percentages pretty much across the board than white men did. White men are the majority population within all computing fields. And so you can see that 68% of women said they were talked over, 79% of people with a disability said they've been talked over in meetings, 67% of Hispanic and Latinx people said that they received lower pay than other people in similar positions, 35% of Black and African American people said that they had been disciplined more frequently or harsher. And 24% of people with disabilities said that they had been disciplined more frequently or harsher, which was interesting to me. I hadn't seen something connecting those before. And so I'm curious about that particular stat. But I just thought that this was an interesting way of thinking about the data and presenting it in a way that shows that there are disparities across underrepresented identities within computing. So the other thing that I want to highlight for you is this NSF workshop on cyber infrastructure workforce. This happened last fall in September, August, September, and they brought together about 100 professionals from across HPC in various, industry, academia, research, all of those things. And we came together for about 4 days over the course of several weeks And we presented 12 thematic challenges. And those challenges, I didn't want to make you read them because there's a lot of them, but they are diversity and inclusion, fostering the development and support of the workforce ecosystem and talent pipeline, establishing viable career paths and normative role descriptions in the workforce, enhancing internal and external communications and education for stakeholders, compensation, workforce sustainability, the establishment of an identity in the field as a discipline, the position of research computing within institutional organizations, and the need for continuing training and education for professionals. So all of those themes are very similar to what has shown up in the other research. And so I thought that was a really interesting outcome from that meeting from people who are working specifically in this area. From those 12 thematic challenges, we made recommendations for the university and research organizations community, the NSF, and the cyber infrastructure and research computing communities. So they took all of these issues and broke them down into, okay, so this is what's going on. Here are some recommendations for what we should do. And then based on those findings, we presented them to the NSF through a report and a presentation, and then there were 7 action groups that were formed. I'm not sure how those action groups are doing. I know that one of the ones that I'm part of is still meeting, the diversity and inclusion one. One of the other groups that I joined has not had any meetings that I'm aware of, and I haven't heard anything back from anybody else. So I actually took it as a to-do item for preparing this presentation to go and check in with everybody and see how they're doing. But hopefully there are some good things that come out of that now that we've had kind of a good brainstorming session about what is going on and what we hope will be solutions. So to talk a little bit about my study, what I looked at in my study was occupational climate and career withdrawal cognition. So again, with the definitions, high performance computing is the field that supports the operation, use, and enhancement of supercomputers. Cyber infrastructure professionals were anybody working in HPC. And for the purposes of my study, I also included people who were in purely administrative roles, although I didn't get very many respondents in that category because I think those folks, even though they are working within HPC, maybe don't define themselves as being cyber infrastructure professionals. Identity in this context is race and ethnicity and gender. The majority identities were white and male. Career withdrawal cognitions is the ideations of leaving a field of work. So I have considered leaving HPC, or this makes me want to stay in HPC. Are you thinking about leaving the whole field as a result of your experience within the occupational climate, which was, what is your experience with the workplace psychological priorities extended across an entire occupation? So the experience within your organization, how does that go across all of the organizations, and how does that impact the thought that you are wanting to potentially leave HPC? So all of that leads to the research question, which is, what occupational climate factors influence the retention of cyber infrastructure professionals, and how is this relationship impacted by race and gender? With the hypotheses that there is a negative relationship between CI professionals' experience with occupational climate factors and their career withdrawal cognitions. So the better the occupational climate, the less likely they are to be thinking about leaving. And CI professionals' racial and gender identities will moderate the impact of the occupational climate experiences on withdrawal cognitions. So there will be an impact of race and gender on the likelihood that somebody is thinking about leaving. A little bit about the survey instrument. This was a one-time survey that used the NCAR and UCAR workplace culture survey. So that survey, again, was designed for one organization, but I wanted to stretch it across multiple organizations to see if that turned into an occupational climate factor. And Michael's inspector's career withdrawal cognition measure, which was just 3 quick questions. I studied anybody who was a cyber infrastructure professional in the United States in late July, early August 2020, which of course was during COVID. And there were minimal ethical concerns. I very intentionally did not collect any identifying information in the survey because we work with data professionals. And if anybody got a hold of my data set, I knew that people could figure out who was who, and I didn't want to risk that. So no information that was identifying was collected at any point, and I will destroy all of that data in a couple of years. So my participants, this starts out really big with all the white folks on the side, and then it gets really small really quickly when you get into different racial backgrounds. I had initially 443 responses. It whittled down to 421 respondents that were cleaned up. Anybody who didn't respond to both race and gender or didn't respond to the withdrawal cognitions questions was cleaned out of the data set because those were essential to what I was looking at, and so they had to go. It's important to note that half of the people of color that were listed in here were born in countries other than the United States, which I don't think probably surprises anybody who works in cyber infrastructure, that we have a lot of international folks around. Something that is important to note that I was so pleased about when I saw my data is that I had 7 people respond who identified as Indigenous. And Indigenous people included American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander folks. And so when I mentioned this to a colleague who is Native American in a meeting, she was like, "You had 7 respondents? I thought I was the only one." And so that response highlighted to me how important it is to start to do this data and to start to bring people together. She thought she was the only Indigenous person in HPC, but 7 people responded to my survey. And so how amazing would it be to bring those 7 people together so that they could support one another and mentor one another and help each other through making it through this field. So that one little story kind of highlights for me why it's so important to be gathering the data and to start to really understand who we are as a field and who's here. So the model ended up looking like this. And I realize this is a little hard to see on the screen, but the factors that I have are workplace atmosphere, perspective taking, what companies do, colleagues' bad behavior, and getting work done. And so those factors came out of a factor analysis of the survey that I was presented. The original survey said that it was going to have 6 different factors, but they didn't quite shake out that way when I looked at my data and the way that cyber infrastructure professionals responded. And so I ended up with 5 factors. Workplace atmosphere was everything from I trust my supervisor to I have all of the things I need to do my job. That ended up being kind of a catch-all for the various other factors from the original survey factors. Perspective taking was a set of questions that asked, my organization is welcoming for, and then it had a list below it of people with different identities. So white men, white women, women of color, men of color, people with disabilities, people who are veterans of the armed forces, all sorts of different identities that mirrored the demographic information that I collected in the survey. So I was able to look at how welcoming do women of color believe that their organizations are, and how welcoming does everybody else think that those organizations are for women of color? And I'll talk a little bit about what happened with that in a couple of slides. What companies do is things like diversity education programs, having policies that impact people's experiences at the organization, things like that. Colleagues' bad behavior was things like bullying, harassment. I asked within the last year, have you seen someone do XYZ? And that one was one of the ones that I think was impacted by COVID, because at that point we had already been working from home for 6 months. And so people's bad behavior may have been a little bit different than it would be normally if we were all actually physically in the same place. And getting work done was just 2 questions that asked, I trust my colleagues to get work done on time, and I trust them to get it done in a quality manner. It was very simplified. But what you can see here is that we expected all of those factors to have an impact on people's withdrawal cognitions, and race and gender identity were impacting that relationship. So hypothesis number 1 was partially supportive. I conducted a stepwise multiple regression to evaluate whether the factors predicted withdrawal cognitions. The model explained 26% of the variance in withdrawal cognitions, which is actually pretty good. For both race and gender, the underrepresented people had higher rates of withdrawal cognitions than their majority counterparts, which is not super surprising. Workplace atmosphere, how work gets done, and colleagues' bad behavior were predictors of withdrawal cognition. So you can see that these 3 things are represented in this model that's on the screen right now. Workplace atmosphere was the strongest indicator of people's withdrawal cognitions and accounted for 21% of the variance in the model. So those 3 factors did have an impact, the other ones did not. For hypothesis number 2, race moderated the relationship between perspective taking and what companies do, and there were no moderation effects for gender, which was surprising, but was what it was. what's interesting here, or something just to note on these, you don't have to totally understand these graphs, but what you're seeing here is that what companies do and perspective taking. And the dotted line is people from underrepresented races, and the solid line is white people. And what I think is really interesting about these two simple slopes graphs is that you can see that as people's withdrawal cognitions are higher, their perspective taking, people are thinking that if things are really bad, that's that lower number, their withdrawal cognitions are higher. But what you see on both of these charts is that the underrepresented folks have a much slower decline, whereas the white people, it's almost like once we realize that there's something wrong, we're like, whoa, hang on a second here. But we're just a little bit more reactive than the folks of color are. And I think that probably indicates a greater overall awareness in the first place. And so people of color are like, yeah, companies do stuff to help with diversity and inclusion, and it may or may not impact my idea of staying in the field or not. But white folks are a little bit more impressed by that, and it just makes us more aware, I think, because we have so much more to learn. And the same with the perspective taking. Once white folks become aware that things are bad for other people, it really, once that empathy activates, we're much more reactive and much more likely to leave the field. So part of what I did was some exploratory analyses. I had so much data, I needed to go in and have a little bit of fun and just see what else the data could tell me. And within that, there was some really interesting information. So we found that white men are having a significantly different experience of most of the occupational climate factors, workplace atmosphere, perspective taking, what companies do, and colleagues' bad behavior. How work gets done, for some reason, there wasn't a difference there, which to me indicated that people trust their colleagues to get their work done and get it done on time. So that's an interesting kind of outtake from that little tidbit there. I wanted to look specifically at what was going on with people in technical roles. So I had people respond from across the spectrum of roles within cyber infrastructure. But the technical roles, I think, are what people generally think of as cyber infrastructure. So I wanted to look at that specifically. Men had significantly lower withdrawal cognitions than people with underrepresented genders, and white people had lower withdrawal cognitions than people of color. Again, not super surprising, but now I've got a little bit of data to support that. There was this really interesting question that I asked, which actually got cut out of all of the other analyses because they didn't fit neatly into any of the themes, but I wanted to look at them because they're an interesting set of questions. And that was, I believe diversity and inclusion should be core values of our institution, and I believe diversity and inclusion are core values of our institution. And those two questions were rated significantly different by gender, but not by race. So there's a different perception by women and non-binary people about how important D&I should be in our institution and how important it actually is. It was a little bit of a surprise that race did not turn out to be significant there. And I think that might have been because, as I mentioned before, most of 50% of the non-white respondents were international folks. And so I'm wondering if there might be a cultural difference there that impacted that answer. I don't know, and that definitely bears further research. The other important thing to see from those analyses, and I'll explain this a little bit on the next slide, is that white women and women of color rated their organizations as significantly less welcoming for themselves than everybody else rated them. So let's look at those numbers and it'll help explain it a little bit. So what you see here is the identity in that first column. The second column is the mean rating of people who have that identity. The third column is the rating of people who don't have that identity. So how welcoming do you think your organization is for people who identify as trans if you don't identify as trans? And then the p-value shows how significant it was. And so what you can see here is that white women and women of color had a significantly different response. They said that things were significantly less welcoming than everybody else thought that they were for those people. Men of color, very interestingly, we had spot on. The way that men of color rated how welcoming their organizations were was very similar to how everybody else said how welcoming the organizations were for men of color. And white men, it was very close as well. Almost significant, but not quite. So what you see there is that for some reason, we understand what's going on in HBC for men, regardless of their race. but we don't have a very good understanding of the experiences of women within high performance computing. And so I imagine if we had taken this survey 8 years ago, it would have been even worse. I think the Women in a High Performance Computing Organization has done a lot of really great work in this area and has probably helped narrow that gap, but there still exists a significant difference in how people are perceiving our field for women and versus what they are actually experiencing. The p-value for people who identify as trans or non-binary is not significant, but it's still worth including because it's still a pretty huge difference. It was 2.57. It was out of 5 people who identified as trans and non-binary gave it a 2.57 for how welcoming their organizations were for them. And everybody else said that it was a 3.07. Again, I didn't have enough respondents to make this a significant number. I think if we had had more trans and non-binary respondents, it would have been a significant p-value, but it's still worth noting because even the data that I got was off by 0.5, and that's very significant on that scale. So strengths of this study were the sample diversity. We oversampled women. We think, we don't really know how many women we have in HPC, but I think we oversampled with 33% of respondents versus we think that there are about 13 to 15% of people in HPC identify as women. I had 425 responses and I only needed 375 to receive the 95% confidence interval. So that was really amazing. Thank you to anybody in the room who helped me get more responses for the survey. And there's a ton of room for future research from the data set that I have. So there's a whole section that asks about people's experiences at conferences that I have not even touched. I haven't even looked at how many people have responded to it. And so if there's anybody out there, a grad student or anybody who's interested in writing a paper about conference experiences in HPC, reach out to me because I would love some partners to get that information out into the world. Some limitations, I didn't have very many responses from industry. And I think that kind of pointed to this thing that was mentioned a few times about like, we don't know what cyber infrastructure means. Who is a cyber infrastructure professional? I received a lot of emails from people saying, this is what I do. Am I a CI professional? And the answer in every single case was yes. But I think that indicates, again, like we just don't know what CI is, who is a cyber infrastructure professional, and what does that mean? And so we definitely need to work on that. Again, the factor analysis didn't quite line up with the factors that were indicated by the survey design. So I would like to reuse the survey again and see if we get the same factors. I think what I came up with was very strong, but the original survey didn't match up. And so that's a little bit wonky. And then of course, I took the survey during COVID. And so people's experiences with HPC as they were experiencing them at that time were all over the place. And I think people were kind of in distress and they may have been thinking they wanted to stay in HPC at higher rates because I think on the whole, HPC did a good job of adapting to the COVID circumstances, but we don't really have any way to know that. So I'll mention on the future research, we need to do another survey after COVID. So future research, we need to understand a little bit more about who CI professionals are and what it's like to be one. So what are the experiences of leaders with underrepresented identities in HPC? Initially, when I thought about my dissertation, I was going to focus just on women directors of HPC centers, but there were only like 4 in the world that we could name, 4 or 5 in the world that we could name, and that was just a very small data set. And so I decided to broaden it out and do a quantitative survey. But it would be really interesting to talk to folks with underrepresented identities and say, like, what's it like to be a leader in HPC? How did you get where you are? How do people treat you as a leader in this field? How do the intersections of identities impact CI professionals' experiences? Again, I looked at it a little bit with the intersection of race and gender, but I didn't get into disability or LGBT or anything like that. That would also be really interesting and good to know. How does the climate and conferences influence withdrawal cognition? Again, if anybody's interested in looking at that, I have some data for it, and I would love some partner to do that work. What is it like to be trans, indigenous, or a person with disability in HPC? Those are identities that I think we don't have a ton of people who have those identities. Maybe the people with disabilities is a lot more than we think it is, but it would be interesting to know, what is it like to work in HPC? What barriers are you encountering? What things have helped you? How can we help make things better so that you can stay because you're awesome? And finally, how is the occupational climate in HPC different after COVID? I think that Unfortunately, we don't have any before COVID data, because it would have been interesting to get before, during, and after data, but we definitely need to talk about what it's like after COVID, and kind of track how it goes returning to work, whatever that ends up looking like for our field. So what do we do with all of this? I've given you a lot in the last 40 minutes. And so where do we take this? I think that one of the huge takeaways for me is that all cyber infrastructure professionals need to be engaged in envisioning what this climate is going to be. And we need to communicate constantly about diversity and inclusion in the occupational climate that we all want to create. What showed up over and over again in other people's studies, in my study, in parts of my data that I didn't even have time to talk about today, is that cyber infrastructure is ruled by white men. It's mostly men in positions of power. It's mostly men who are in visible positions. It's mostly white men. And so we need to bring everybody in having conversations about what we want this to be, because living, me as a woman in a world that's designed for men doesn't really work for me necessarily. And so to really feel included in the field, we need to make sure that we are figuring out what does work for me. We need to train everybody on how to have difficult conversations, how to practice work, how to notice workforce issues that affect colleagues, and how to stand up when they see bad things happening. That goes back to that belonging question where we said, apparently our understanding of what is going on with women is very different than what women actually feel that they're experiencing in our field. And so we need to be able to notice those things and to stand up and to help make sure that we are improving things for white women and women of color, and people with disabilities and other people of color and all of that. So, but in order to do that, we have to be able to have difficult conversations. We have to notice what's going on around us. We need to start implementing or continue implementing programs that we know aid to the retention of underrepresented people, mentoring programs, employee resource groups, caucus spaces at conferences, places for connection and for building those mentoring relationships and helping to really support people to keep them here. I'm happy to report that we are planning to do some caucus spaces at the supercomputing conference. So we will be providing some affinity group space for people of color to get together, for people with disabilities, for Indigenous folks to meet one another and see one another and develop those mentoring and those collaboration relationships, so that hopefully they can build their happiness within the field and stick with us. HBC leadership needs to listen to the needs of underrepresented people at their organizations and update your policies and procedures accordingly. What companies do did not show up as being very significantly impactful, but that was surprising. And we know from other research that generally policies and procedures that companies put in place does impact retention. So we need to make sure that we're looking at policies. Are disability policies inclusive? Are paternity and maternity and parental leave policies inclusive? Are they actually supportive of people, or do they make people feel like I don't want to have a kid because I can't afford to do it with what is happening in my workplace? There's a huge list of policies that we need to look at and make sure that we're making as inclusive as possible. And finally, and potentially most importantly, we need to engage white men to be change agents and partners. As I've mentioned, white men have most of the power in high performance computing. And so if we're going to see change, we need their help. They're the ones who are setting policies. They're the ones who are doing hiring. They're the ones who are running conferences. And so if white men don't get engaged within this work, we're going to keep stalling. There are various ways that we can do that. There's some interesting research that shows that if you provide specific objectives and mechanisms for white men to understand how to implement diversity and inclusion within their groups and within their spaces, that they do a lot better. And especially, this sounds mercenary, but it works if you tie pay and reward structures to those climate and diversity goals. Again, that sounds a little like icky to say that you're not going to get a pay increase if you don't do this, but why would somebody who's already in power do something that might make them feel like they're losing power, or they may be losing standing, unless you provide them with incentive to do it? I like to think that people will do it out of the goodness of their hearts, but that's not always the case. And so tying that pay and reward structure to it, it just gives one more incentive to do the right thing once people understand what the right thing is. And so that is the end of my talk. I absolutely welcome questions from anyone. If you have anything that you want to email me with, if you want to do some research, reach out to me through my email, which is ajlauer@ucar.edu, or on Twitter. I'm on there all the time at ajlauer through Twitter. So I'm happy to hear whatever questions you all have been rolling in on Slido.
Thanks, AJ. And yeah, if anyone has a question out there, please put it in the Slido. We cannot see you, so you need to put it in Slido so we can see your question. So the first question, AJ, is how would you recommend being more intentional about DEI in HPC?
So I think that gets, this question maybe was asked a little bit early in the presentation. I think that gets back to the things that I just mentioned. We need to have constant conversations about it. We need to create intentional space to have conversations about DEI, and we need to look at policies and procedures and training people on how to notice DEI issues and how to talk about it and bring it up.
Okay, thanks. The next question is from Annette. How much of your findings do you think is valid for non-CI HPC professionals?
I don't know. And so unfortunately, I had very few administrative folks respond to the questionnaire. I think it was only like 10 or 15 people. And so it wasn't enough to separate it out. I did try to look at everything based on type of role, but I just couldn't, I didn't have the numbers. So that's something that we definitely need to look at, is what are the experiences of people who are in non-CI HPC roles, and because they're in the ecosystem, right? They are impacting the ecosystem and they're being impacted by the ecosystem. So we definitely need to look at that.
Okay, thanks. And Amy Moore asked, thanks for putting your names in there, by the way. It helps us know that who's out there listening to us. How was disability defined? E.g., does it include mental health?
Yes, it was defined however people defined it. So it was self-identification. I didn't ask for specifics because I didn't want to break it down like that. And I thought that that might get a little too close to identifying information. And so I just asked people if they identified as someone who had a disability, and they were able to self-select into that category. So I would assume, yes, if people consider mental health issues to be within the disability range, then it would have.
Okay, thanks. And let's see, Anarelli Morales asked, have you looked at how the environment outside of work influences retention? For example, not sure how diverse Cheyenne, Wyoming is, so bringing in persons of color, LGBTQ people to the environment that may not be as welcoming, how could that influence retention?
Absolutely, we know that it does. I don't have any data on that because, again, I didn't collect location information because I thought that that might be too close to something that someone who's one of our data experts could have figured out who was who. But yes, absolutely. We know from other research that that has an impact on retention. We know we live in Boulder, Colorado, and we have people of color tell us that they don't want to move here. So we can't even get them in the door, much less, once they're here, if people are having bad experiences. I know my interns have had bad experiences in Boulder for being people of color. They've been followed in stores. They've had buses not want to stop and pick them up, things like that. And so 100% it definitely impacts retention, but I don't have data on that yet.
And finally, the last question we have, Jeff DLB is asking, thanks for a very interesting talk. Can you say any more about what white male mid-level managers can do to be change agents and partners?
Yeah, so, white men in any kind of management position can do things like making sure that they have diverse representation on hiring committees, making sure that when you have any employee join, that you're connecting them to employee resource groups. Is there a group for Black people in your organization? Is there a group for LGBT people in your organization, for women, for parents, for whatever identity that somebody might have? Are you connecting people to those resources? Just give them all of the resources and let them self-select into whatever it is that they may need or what might be helpful. Are you checking in with folks on a personal level, not just about their work? I think, something that I've heard working in this field is that there's so much focus on the operations and on the speed and on the tech and all of that, that sometimes we forget that people are human beings and human beings are doing this work. And so check in with people, ask, how are you really doing? How can I help you cope with whatever is going on? And how can I help you balance whatever's going on in your life and what you have going on at work? Do you need a more flexible work arrangement? Whatever it is, making sure that you're connecting with people at that really personable level. And then I would say, doing some self-reflection. Are you, sit down and think about a meeting that you just had recently. Who were you talking to? Whose voices were you amplifying in the room? Who was given credit for what work? Who was given credit for what comments in the meeting? There's a lot of self-auditing that you can do to help you realize where you are at in your ally development and in your support of people who are traditionally underrepresented in your everyday actions, that you can then start to address those actions within yourself and start to model that behavior for the people that you supervise. So lots of things, lots of little things that you all can do that will have a big impact once everybody starts doing it.
Thank you. And then another question from Anonymous. Where are people going when they leave HPC?
I have no idea. I wish I knew, because I would go and try to bring people back, I think. I don't know. There's studies that show that women drop out of the workforce completely. They will go do completely different things. Anecdotally, I can tell you that, at least from interns that have been through our program, we have interns who are faculty in other content areas. We have one intern who opened her own coffee shop and is a professional roaster, which is decidedly not HPC. So I think, we know that people who are in high performance computing are really smart. And so they're probably going all over the place, anywhere that feels like another great place to go and that feels welcoming and inclusive for them.
Okay, we don't have any other questions, Slido, but I was going to ask, you sound like you have a lot of interesting avenues for future research. So in your copious free time, which is the most likely you're going to pursue in the near term?
That conference data is burning a hole in my pocket. I have a whole section where I asked people about their experiences at high performance computing related conferences. I asked them specifically which conferences they had attended in the last couple of years. And then I asked them those belonging questions. So how welcoming do you think HPC conferences are for all of these different groups? I asked them, do they know what the reporting avenues are at HPC conferences? Do they feel comfortable reporting things at conferences that they see without fearing that it's going to have a negative impact on their career? There's a lot of really interesting stuff in there to dig into. And so that's really the thing that I'm most curious about.
Cool, thanks, AJ. It looks like that's all of our questions, and we're close to the top of the hour. So I'll just extend a thanks to you from everyone who attended, and on behalf of Jeff, who organized the seminar. Thanks for your time today, and thanks to everyone who attended.
Thank you, everyone. Take good care.